I'd like to introduce Sylvia. She's a director of Deepening Community, and she will be talking to you about Collective Impact 101. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Sylvia.
Thanks so much, Heather. Welcome, everyone. I don't know how many of you I had the chance to meet recently as we hosted, in partnership with Trillium Foundation, a number of workshops across the province. Certainly sort of looking and thinking about that, I'm aware that typically there's a wide range of understanding and definition for what collective impact is, and so I'm going to assume that for folks who are more knowledgeable, you may need to bear with me, but I'm going to sort of give a general overview, assuming folks know very little. Starting with this definition on the next slide of collective impact. So for those of you who don't know, collective impact really has sort of jumped into people's attention when an article was published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in the winter of 2011, published by two guys with a consulting practice in the U.S. called FSG, and those two are John Kania and his colleague Mark Kramer, and they actually define collective impact as the commitment of an important group of actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social issue in a very structured way. So one of the things that we often get asked at Tamarac, because we do a lot of work in the field of collective impact, is, well, you know, I've been collaborating for a long time. Aren't I, you know, so I'm just doing collective impact, right? And I would say no, not necessarily. So in my experience, collective impact is a form of collaboration, but it's a very unique and disciplined form of collaboration. If we can go to the next slide, I think it's as important to define collective impact by what it is not. So it is not a typical collaboration. The most often, the collaborations that I come across are usually confined to a single sector. So it might be around better alignment across a multitude of different components of a healthcare system, for example. Or sometimes the efforts can sort of toggle health and social services. But collective impact actually is rooted in an assumption that we need all sectors working together and committed to addressing this shared issue. So it moves beyond a single sector, and while there are individual programs and initiatives that are undertaken by a collective impact effort, the collective impact is committed to moving beyond solely delivering programs to encouraging its shared leaders to look at how to truly change systems so that the issues that are arising no longer are created as issues. And while, again, there is a focus on short-term impact and results, you need milestones, you need to show progress. Really, there's a shared commitment beyond the short term to a much more ambitious long-term agenda. If we can go to the next slide. So when Kania and Kramer published their paper in 2011, they really unpacked or presented not just the 5 conditions, which are most often talked about around collective impact, but also 3 preconditions. And these are really critical. They're deeply rooted in community engagement, and they are about building the trust and consensus around that diverse network of players, around what it is that they are going to do together. So I'm going to unpack these 3, but before I do that, I did want to say that one of the things that I find particularly interesting is how the 3 preconditions and 5 conditions of collective impact were identified by Kania and Kramer. And for, as I understand it, their work grew out of an assignment from a network of philanthropists who were really curious to know, for all the investments in all the programs that they'd made over the years, what difference had they made. And Kania and Kramer went out and they did research with a number of the successful grantees of this philanthropy network. And for the most part, they were able to come back and tell the network that the programs that they invested in did have a meaningful and positive impact on the recipients of the programs that they were fortunate enough to fund. But what really caught Kania and Kramer's attention were more outliers. So there was a handful of these grantee projects that had somehow been able to transcend simply delivering programs and were really working to change systems. And they were wildly diverse. So one was about educational achievement in a low-income area. Another was about obesity reduction in young kids in a low-income area. There was another one that was the restoration of a river system that crossed multiple municipal and state boundaries. So each one of them was quite different, but across all 6 there were these common patterns that Kania and Kramer were able to identify, and that's where the roots of these 3 preconditions and 5 conditions come from. So the preconditions, first is influential champions. So what this is calling on the leadership group or the convening group to do is to really ask yourselves, who are influential people within your community or have already identified as being interested in or passionate about the issue that you're trying to work on? And how do you engage them and let them know that you are wanting to work together with them on this, and really enable and encourage them to tap their own networks to help build the legitimacy and credibility of the effort that you're trying to launch? The second of the preconditions, urgency of the issue, really helps to remind you as you're starting a collective impact effort that just because you're passionate and care deeply about this issue doesn't mean it's high necessarily on the radar of the average person in the community. And so it's calling on you to do a bit of a rigorous, objective assessment around how is your issue perceived in the community? And if it isn't perceived highly, maybe some of the early groundwork you need to do with your partners is to begin to build the awareness around your issue as part of that early work. And then finally, of the 3 preconditions, there's adequate resources, which of course does reference funding. And one of the reasons why we at Tamarac are so excited to be partnering with the Trillium Foundation on their collective impact work is that we've been truly impressed by the leadership shown by OTF to innovate and try a new approach and show a willingness to invest differently, because collective impact efforts are much more than programs, right? And so they recognize the need for early investment to convene a group of multi-sector partners together to identify what it is they're going to work on together. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. What you'll see on your screen coming up are the 5 conditions of collective impact that Kania and Kramer identified. So the first, the common agenda, imagine is bringing these diverse players together with a common shared passion around a particular issue and having conversations enough around that table and with others to understand the breadth and richness of this issue from the multitude of perspectives that you've engaged, number 1. And then building consensus at the leadership table and also beyond around not just what it is you might want to work on together, but what your understanding is around the joint approach that you are committed to taking to find innovative new solutions for it. Shared measurement is the second, and I find this probably one of the most unique characteristics of collective impact relative to other forms of collaboration, because it is asking us for a real commitment across this multitude of partners for accountability to each other and metrics that help us to measure as we begin working together and learning together how we're doing. So the metrics are important, the data is important, because we need to be able to track our progress over time. And we need to acknowledge that some of the things that we might innovate together in a collective impact effort are going to be successful and others won't. But if we don't have the data to tell us, we won't know. Also, I think the shared measurement piece is very useful even at the beginning, because what the data tells you about your issue might be very informative for you in terms of how you frame that issue in the community. So to give you a concrete example, drawing on the work of my colleague Liz Weaver and her early days at the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, they were working very hard to engage community members into dialogues around poverty and not getting huge turnout. So it made them, as a leadership group, need to step back and rethink their approach. One of the things that was pivotal was when they looked at the data on who was poor in Hamilton, they realized that an overwhelming majority of those people were children. So they were able then to go back out and totally reframe their approach, absolutely still focused on poverty reduction, but with an aspirational vision around how to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child. And by that, and claiming that, knowing that the data was saying how many of, that the majority of folks in poverty were children, they could advance a policy agenda around poverty reduction. The third of the 3 preconditions is mutually reinforcing activities. So really, this work is collaborative work. So imagine that you're bringing together a multitude of different sectors, some of whom may have worked together in the past, some of whom are just getting to know each other. And you have a shared aspiration in your common agenda. And what you're inviting is the different players who have a stake in a knowledge and a concern about this issue to each sort of speak to one another and to you about what their work is and how it contributes to the common agenda that you're working on. It's interesting that almost always some of the early wins in a collective impact effort come from just allowing people to see how their individual programs align with each other and where there's opportunities to be better at that. Also to identify together some gaps that none of you would have seen because you're all focused up until now on delivering your own programs, which present opportunities to innovate and work together to fill some of those gaps. So it's really about helping everyone to see the pieces of the system that you have and the places and pieces where you can continue to strengthen and change your approach by working together more effectively. Continuous communication is the fourth of the preconditions. And now this is an interesting one because I really think about continuous communication as happening or needing to be tended to on 3 levels. The first level is acknowledging you're bringing different people together to work with folks that they may have never worked with before. And being able, even if we're all English speakers, we all from our different sectors bring different language, sometimes jargon, around how we talk about what we do. And we're not even aware of it anymore. But because we have such diversity around the table, it's about asking each one of us to slow down and unpack some of that jargon, and also make sure that when we're talking about an issue, we mean the same things when we're talking about it. So it's really about slowing down and learning how to work together well with a group of people who may never have worked together before. The second layer of continuous communication is recognizing that many of the people who are involved in a collective impact effort are there on behalf of their organizations. So collective impact efforts aren't organizations. And therefore, we really have to think about how do we help and support those individuals who are here on behalf of their organizations to take back what they're learning from this collaborative effort and share it effectively back throughout their organization to continue to build not just individual but organizational commitment to the effort. And then lastly, collective impact efforts are ultimately about serving your community. And so how is it that as your collective impact effort unfolds, you're taking back to the community and reporting back to the community on what you're learning and the progress that you're making? And then finally, the fifth condition is backbone support. So for those of you who have read the early article on collective impact, one of the things you'll notice is that the language around this fifth condition has changed. Originally, it was referred to as a backbone organization, but in the reality, as people have continued to evolve this work, the important clarification that has come forward is it's actually useful to not necessarily think of this as an organization, but rather thinking about across the multitude of players you're bringing together, what's the infrastructure that's needed to help you coordinate your work effectively. And there are many different approaches and designs for effective backbones. I think my colleague Liz Weaver recently wrote a blog identifying 4 typical approaches or forms of backbone that she's seen, all of which are effective. A lot of it depends on how you tailor what you need to the resources that you have available in your unique situation. If we can move to the next slide. So this is really important. What it says here is that in our experience of implementing collective impact efforts, and Tamarac has really done a lot of work through our Vibrant Communities Poverty Reduction efforts, that though we didn't have the language of collective impact at the time, absolutely aligned with a collective impact approach. And what this slide reminds all of us is it's really, really useful to think about this work as unfolding in phases, and that depending on where your collective impact is in relation to its maturity, really emphasizes, it changes sort of the nature of the work that's underway in each one of these components of success. I think the other thing to really kind of take away from this slide is the reminder that collective impact is long-term work. It's not short-term. This is not, a quick fix 12 to 18-month program. This is a commitment of a multitude of different sectors, leaders, and organizations to learn and work together over 3 to 5 years to really make lasting impact and systems change. If we can go to the next slide. So, thank you. So ultimately, what collective impact at the core is recognizing is that up until now, the majority of us tend to work individually on an organization by organization or program by program basis. And while that can be effective, it doesn't often produce the long-term kind of results that many of us are striving for in terms of the issues and opportunities that we're working on. So programs absolutely are part of a collective impact effort, but the work of a collective impact is way beyond that. And it really is about coordinating and braiding together the efforts of multiple organizations and aligning them towards the same goal. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. And the next one. So at the beginning, I think I was talking to you about how is collective impact different as a form of collaboration. And in this visual, what you'll see is that there's a whole range of options for how an organization might want to structure itself when it wants to take on a big issue, right? And I think one of the reasons I like this picture in particular is that on the far left you see that competition is actually acknowledged. And I think that's important because for many of us in organizations, we are often competing with one another. And paradoxically, in many collective impact efforts, organizations that may be collaborating on the effort in other realms may be actively competing with each other around different phases of work. And where the red box has been drawn is the realm of collective impact. So it's much more intentional in how the groups are working together on an issue. If you can click the next part of the slide. Not surprisingly, as folks move along the continuum from left to right, people's perception of turf is declining through how you're working together. And at the same time, the level of trust required to effectively move along the continuum and the spectrum increases. So, I think the other piece is, I hope that you're taking from this, collective impact isn't always the answer for everything. There are times when coexisting or cooperating are absolutely fine. So it really is a decision about when and if collective impact working across sectors on a shared issue is the right solution for the opportunity that you want to work on. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. These 5 questions came out of the work of the White House Council on Community Solutions. So this was a national U.S. effort to really better understand the situation with respect to what they call opportunity youth, which are folks neither in school nor employed and under 30. The White House Council used collective impact as the recommended framework for advancing this work. And they developed these 5 questions for themselves to really help clarify the commitment that is required in a collective impact effort. So this is a useful set of questions for a leadership team in an organization to sort of think about and talk about before engaging in a collective impact effort, if that's what you're hoping to do. It's also a useful resource to review with boards if you're accountable to a volunteer board and you want to make sure that they understand it as well. In our experience, if you find that an organization can't sort of powerfully say yes to at least 3 of these, that's usually a signal that you need to do a bit more groundwork and that you're not quite ready or sure around the commitment of a collective impact effort. So it's also a really good sort of assessment tool. Okay, if you can move to the next slide. I really like this because what it does is takes the 5 conditions of collective impact and really helps and unpacks the different elements that you're exploring and needing to clarify in the work in order to build an effective collective impact effort. You can go to the next slide as well. Wow. So I find this a really useful slide, but somewhat overwhelming when you first see it. Credit goes to FSG for this slide, but what it is for folks that are sort of more linear or unsure around, does collective impact seem like the right solution for you? It's like a logic tree, right, where you can help us yourselves individually or, with your leadership teams really assess whether or not collective impact makes sense for the work that you're trying to accomplish. If we can go to the next slide. I kind of like this one a little bit better, only because it feels cleaner and simpler. But really, this is an outline of sort of the big pieces of an early collective impact effort. So you want to start to build and convene that leadership team from multiple sectors who are going to help define the common agenda. Really kind of engaging beyond that core team to start to assess consensus around your work. Really then beginning to get a better understanding of the issue from multiple perspectives and developing a framework that you can share with others that starts to identify some of your priority areas for action and what your understanding of the issue or opportunity is. And then being ready and willing to kind of take it out and test it with different perspectives and allow it to be refined by their thinking. And then it's about moving into action around defined priorities. Often working groups are established for each of the emerging priorities. And then ultimately, over time, it's about really looking for ways in which you can engage and support community action as collective impact is unfolding. If we can go to the next slide, Heather. I really love this image of the manager of the construction site as a really good definition of that backbone role. So, it's almost like an orchestra conductor as well. You're trying to sort of make sure that all these different players, each with their own skill, are aligned and working well together. There's been lots written about this role and how it evolves over time, but the 6 bullets there on the left really outline the core roles that the backbone infrastructure plays in supporting the collective impact effort. And often this backbone role is made up or kind of guided by the leadership team of a collaborative effort, and maybe at the beginning just 1 or maybe even 2 staff people. So it's a very small group that grows over time. If we can go to the next slide. This is actually a really interesting slide. As collective impact has really gained popularity and resonance, not surprisingly, lots of groups are springing up and claiming that they are doing a collective impact effort. Some are and some aren't. But one of the things that's interesting is there's a perception that if you're the backbone, you're in charge. That's not completely true, and there's lots of different myths that are outlined here that around what the role of the backbone is. And what it isn't. So I think it's important to sort of put those out there so that you can recognize what is in the backbone role and what are some very common misperceptions about what it is. Okay, if we can move to the next slide. Recently, when we were doing some work with John Kenya, one of the comments he made really sort of struck me anyway, which is, about 4 or 5 years in and seeing lots of collective impact efforts springing up everywhere on a whole range of issues, he's being pretty reflective. And one of the things that he commented on was the fact that he was beginning to recognize that the 3 preconditions and 5 conditions that I've just reviewed with you are necessary but not sufficient if one really wants to achieve the full promise of what collective impact offers us. Because ultimately, his observation is collective impact, when it's done well, actually invites each and every player to stand still and be open to seeing that the way that you've always done things as part of the problem as well, and that the way forward may also require all the different partners to shift and change how they think about things. And if we're not willing to sort of make those mindset shifts and recognize how we're doing things differently, then it's not going to get us where it is we hope we need to get to. So if we can move to the next slide, I just want to go over for us what are 3 core shifts or changes in how we think about things that collective impact offers to the leaders of that effort and everyone involved, frankly. So the first real shift is inviting us to rethink who needs to be involved in this initiative. What the call of the multiple sectors coming together is about is reminding us we don't want the same old people that we always work with to be the only people who are involved in a collective impact effort. Often the most important innovations come from bringing people who we wouldn't normally talk to who share a common passion about an issue. So we want to make sure particularly that we have the voice of the lived experience of our issue embedded at multiple levels throughout a collective impact effort, both at the steering committee level and at the working group level. Sometimes that takes a lot of time to build trust and clarity, but what I think folks with the lived experience of the issue bring to the table, which is critical for everyone, is that sense of the urgency of the issue and also a practicality about what solutions will work and which ones won't. And why? Okay, if we can go to the next slide. The second big mindset shift is really changing how people work together. So beyond creating the common agenda and that commitment around a common intent, it is that the need in a collective impact effort to both balance content expertise and best practices and promising solutions that have worked effectively in other jurisdictions and blend it effectively with context expertise. So those are the people in that particular community or who live with that issue who can help to shape and redefine a promising practice from somewhere else in ways that it will actually work and make sense in your community. And lastly, it really is about allowing these multiple perspectives time to dialogue with one another and really spend time collectively seeing your shared issue from each other's perspective, learning from each other and from the data by stepping back and looking at our issue in new ways, and then ultimately challenging ourselves and each other to rethink how we're framing the problem. And when we change how we're looking at the problem or how we're defining it, it's astounding sometimes how new opportunities will emerge from that. So if I think about it, a great example coming from the work of the Forum for Youth Investment in the United States was a recognition when they brought multiple players together that each one of them was funded to deliver programs for youth that were focused on preventing problems. So preventing drug use, preventing teen pregnancy, preventing involvement with the criminal justice system, preventing them from graduating from high school. And when they all got together and mapped out what was important, and a reframe that emerged was that a child who is problem-free isn't the same as a child who's ready for life. And that there's a lot of great literature that helps us to define and understand what readiness looks like, and the fact that it's not necessarily embedded in any curriculum. And that in framing their issue differently then helps reveal a whole host of opportunities for innovation and new solutions. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Third big mindset shift is to move beyond thinking solely about programs to really being intentional about how do we shift the system. So, part of the tension, it's big aha in some ways, in the past we've often funded programs and been frustrated that the system hasn't changed. But frankly, if you're going to change the system, that has to be intentionally kind of thought through and built into your work plan, distinct and different from any programs you might deliver. So if you can go to the next slide. What is listed here are 4 really great strategies to get to systems change. So the first one, increasing coordination, really is where some of the early wins in a collective impact effort come from. You've brought different players together. They're thinking and learning about each other more intentionally for the first time. And as they map out their work to one another, they will absolutely see opportunities to streamline referrals, opportunities for eliminating gaps because of, some rules and definitions of boundaries, that kind of thing. The second sort of strategy around policy change and systems change comes from really then, I'm going to jump ahead one, enhancing your services. So as the different players align what they are doing, they will also see gaps and opportunities to fill those gaps by enhancing the services that they offer. Thirdly is learning through prototyping. I like to call this creating safe fail experiments. At the very core, part of what an assumption that's sort of embedded in collective impact is we are wanting to do something that's different from what we've always done it, because we're recognizing that what we've always done isn't getting us to the place that we really want to get to. So therefore, we don't have a roadmap or a clear sense of what that's going to be. It's an invitation by thinking together that we're going to try new things. Some of those new things are going to work and some of them aren't, and that's fine. Our data will help us identify that, but whatever we do differently together is an opportunity to learn and to shift and to change. And then finally, the fourth strategy of systems change is really looking at policy. I like to think of policy in some ways as sort of like the rules of the game, or shifting the environment, cultivating a new environment where it's easier and more effective to implement the kind of promising innovations that are coming out of your work. Sometimes those policy changes can be organizational, sometimes they're municipal or provincial or federal. It really can run the gamut. And as your work unfolds, it's about looking for and recognizing opportunities around policy change. Okay, next slide. I think the other big mindset shift embedded in collective impact is an acknowledgement of collaborative leadership. So no longer are we looking at positional leadership and assuming that any one sector has all the answers. In fact, collective impact is saying we don't. No one sector, these kinds of issues that we're working on right now are beyond the scope and scale of any one sector working alone to meaningfully address them. And so it's calling us to come together and learn new ways of working together that harness the shared wisdom and ability and talent of multiple sectors. And that work takes time to sort of build a foundation around. Okay, next slide, please. I don't know how many of you are familiar with how bamboo grows, but for those of you who aren't, it's not unusual for a little bamboo plant to shoot up about an inch above the ground and stay that way for many years, to the point where, cynical and impatient gardeners like myself would be tempted to rip them all out because clearly that's not thriving. But funnily enough, in the seventh year, it's not unusual for these tiny little bamboo shoots to shoot up as much as 150 meters in an hour. And part of the reason for that is all those years when you thought nothing was happening, a rich root system of connection was sort of being established underneath the soil that's capable of actually sustaining that kind of tremendous growth. And I love that as an analogy to think about collective impact efforts. It is initially slow work. You're building trust. You're stepping back. You're willing to let go of how you've always seen things and be challenged by someone else's view of the same issue and opportunity to find new ways to work together. And one of the gifts I think that Kenya and Kramer have given us when publishing Collective Impact is that they simply and elegantly defined with their 3 preconditions and 5 conditions sort of the core elements of how to work differently together. I love that. But sadly, as elegant and simple as the 3 preconditions and 5 conditions are, when you actually do the work and try and figure out how to make those real, the 3 preconditions and 5 conditions in the context of your community and your work, it's messy. And there isn't always a clear playbook that will give you all the right answers. So you need to go in embracing the spirit of experimentation and safe fail experiments. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Just want to highlight for you some of the upcoming Tamarac learning events that we are hosting. Our Deepening Community event in Edmonton, June 7th to 9th with John McKnight, Vicki Kamak, Alet Mansky, Paul Bourne. It's really focused at the neighborhood level and how we cultivate citizen leadership. And our Community Change Institute, September 26th to 30th in Toronto. And you'll see below some of the incredible keynotes that we have secured: Severin Suzuki, Roger Martin, Francis Wesley, Stephen Patrick. Now, because of our collaboration with the OTF, we have a good and strong discounts and incentives for registration at these events for OTF folks. And you would speak to Heather, who you heard at the beginning of this webinar, to find out more about what that would mean. And if we can go to the next slide. For those of you who may not be able to get away for multiple days, we also have a number of one-day workshops coming that are a little bit closer to home. Paul Bourne is leading a Deepening Community for Collective Impact session in Toronto and in London in June, and I'm doing one in Aurelia. So again, great subsidies are available for OTF staff and grantees who are interested in coming to these events and deepening your own learning. So hope to see a number of you in person. And then, in terms of OTF's ongoing commitment to capacity building around collective impact, what you'll see as well is opportunities to take advantage of some of Tamarac's upcoming webinars, which are completely free. Gearing up for social change with the folks at Nesta and the Canadian Learning Bond, Investing in Education and Beyond, on May 24th. So you can find those online at tamaraccommunity.ca and go ahead and register for anything that catches your eye. Next slide.
All right.
We're done. The formal presentation part.
Right, so I want to thank Sylvia for taking her time and to giving us this amazing presentation of Collective Impact 101. We do have some time for some questions. So if you want to just type your questions into the chat box, I will read them out. We probably have time for maybe 3 or 4, and then we'll give Sylvia a chance to respond. So I'll throw it back to
Can also be comments too, right?
Yeah.
Around things that really resonated for you. That's also welcome.
Mm-hmm.
But while we're waiting for folks to log in, were there any burning questions that popped into your mind?
Actually, I have a question about when do you know if collective impact is not the right for you? Is it?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think you have to kind of figure out whether, your issue is a complex one, for one thing, right? Because sometimes, if your issue is not complex and it's easier to solve, you don't need to bring the multiple sectors together. It's when you feel like you keep doing the same thing over and over and never getting to a high impact place with respect to your issue that you might want to take a look at collective impact as an option. And then I think, as you go out, I think it's sort of iterative work. You do some work and then you present it out in the community and you'll get feedback, and then you'll get a sense of there's momentum here and interest in moving forward, because you can't do this alone. And sometimes there isn't a ton of passion or interest around that issue, and that just might mean now is not the time, right? Or there needs to be more groundwork done, or there needs to be sort of more opportunity to frame the issue, and that's okay too. So often, many successful collective impact efforts, in fact, are probably built on the ashes of failed collaborative attempts, right? And so often, even if your effort doesn't ultimately go forward, the seeds of the work that you've done continue on. And maybe at another point, when the energy has shifted or the environment is different, there may be more of a community appetite. It's a bit of a dance. Are there questions kind of bubbling in?
I don't see any questions coming in. Oh, wait, we have one here.
Okay.
Could a project that is focused on one short-term goal that affects many organizations be defined as a collective impact?
One short-term goal that impacts many organizations?
Be defined as a collective impact.
Well, I think I would go back to the very beginning and say, is there interest across multiple sectors to work on this issue, first of all? Or is it a single sector issue only? Because if it's a single sector effort, even if it affects multiple organizations, I would say it's more an opportunity for perhaps some collaboration. But if it's all within the same sector and all solely focused on improving organizations, my sense is, no, it's not a collective impact effort.
Okay.
But it's hard because I don't know enough of the context.
Right, right. I have another question about backbones. Are backbones better situated when it bubbles up? Or is it more of a, we are the backbone, so it designated?
I've seen both work, but I think at the core, backbones that are effective are ones that are able to be neutral, but commend respect from and across the multiple players engaged in an issue. So that's one thing. Sometimes, and I've seen this happen, some original conveners might start a collective impact effort. We saw one in New Hampshire, for example, where an endowment for health and a community foundation were the original conveners of a collaborative effort that embraced many sectors to address issues of children's behavioral health. But what they did, and they said from the beginning, was they saw their role very much as incubating this idea and this strategy that built consensus across the different sectors around opportunities for action. But once there was endorsement around an action plan, it was fully their intent to issue an RFP. And any organization in the community who felt that they had the capacity and skill set required was encouraged to step up and bid on providing the backbone support. Sometimes it's shared across multiple organizations. Sometimes it moves from one host to another. There's lots and lots of different options. But almost always, I think, that expression of form following function, I think the backbone has to really reflect and be honoring of the kinds of functions of where the group is at and what it needs.
Great. Okay, I have another question.
Okay.
This has been powerful. I am currently implementing a collective impact model to support African American males in Indianapolis. What is the key ground rule for communication among team members?
Oh, that's really a good question. I think I think if you remember at the core, what you're trying to do across the diversity of perspectives in your leadership team is really create a safe container for people to share authentically about their own experience, their worries, their fears. I think investing a meeting amongst that leadership in really talking about, first and foremost, what brings each one of them personally to this issue, and why do they care so deeply about it, and what is the knowledge and skill that they bring, and what are the gifts or the resources that they can contribute, but also what they are really hoping to get from that effort. Investing time in that level of deep, engaging conversations, I think, is a beautiful foundation for then the group, A, building trust with one another, but B, from there, developing for itself some shared principles for how they want to be together. Because there will be times when the work is tough. Like if you're really wanting to shift the system, you're going to have to butt up against some people's, deeply held beliefs and have a trust in one another that you can be heard even if you don't agree with each other. So that is absolutely not time wasted. And I know that there are some very good initial starting places for principles and practices for how one really authentically listens and dialogues well with each other. I can think of one which are the circle principles and practices of a circle dialogue that you can find at peerspirit.com as one example of maybe a good starting place if you didn't want to start with a blank piece of paper. But I think investing that time and really creating shared understanding is never a bad idea.
Yeah, I truly believe communication is a key foundation to a very solid collective impact initiative.
And it takes time, right, to get there with each other.
It takes time, and it takes effort, but it's also very important. It's not a piece that you can just do by flying by the seat of your pants. You need a strategy, and you need to do it, really.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing I would say is, the most powerful collective impact efforts are the ones that are able to engage people's heads and their hearts. And that is as true for going out to the community around building momentum for a collective impact effort, but it also has to be reflected at that leadership table and all the tables, right? So head and heart, what's the passion?
So I have another question. What is your experience of the ways resources like money and staff can be shared among the members of a collective impact initiative?
I think there's, in some ways, no end to how that can happen. I think, but one of the things I've certainly seen in the collective impact work I've done is that money is funny, right? Because money is also sometimes about power, right? So, you know, if money is sort of secured, I think, you know, there needs to be dialogues both at the leadership level around, you know, what is the money being used for, and really setting some clear parameters around the reporting of the use of that money and the progress that the work has funded. That accountability piece, I think, becomes really important. One of the things that I particularly like about the way that Trillium has unfolded its collective impact grant stream is that, you know, there's a recognition that there's really some groundwork that has to happen, and they're willing to invest in helping to do that convening and allow those dialogues to happen to kind of see what percolates as a collective impact effort. And at the end of 1 year, if through the convening the decision is that there isn't enough appetite or willingness to move forward on this collective impact effort, that's not a failure. That's actually a really good thing. And so, you know, because of the phased approach that they have kind of designed into this grant stream, I think it does give opportunity for groups to go in and assess whether there's a willingness and an energy to move an idea forward, and then continue to fund it after key milestones have been met along the way.
All right, so we have an OTF. Is the OTF now insisting that applications involving many organizations working on a common goal follow the collective impact model? Don't know if you know that answer yet, Sylvia?
Well, here's what I will say. I'll say first and foremost, I am not, you know, as someone from Tamarac, I am not pretending to be the grantee expert around what OTF will and will not fund. I think the staff at OTF, the strategy leads, the program managers are probably best positioned to answer that question. But, you know, as I'm understanding it, if you are a group that is collaborating and you're all from the same sector, it does not preclude you from reaching out to Trillium for a seed grant or one of their grow grants. But that collective impact efforts, as I've seen from the way that I've seen them frame it, collective impact efforts that Trillium is willing to fund, have to be linked to the outcomes of their 6 action areas that they have posted and are available online. And I think has to have a commitment to working across sectors and have a multi-sectoral leadership group. And thirdly, have to demonstrate how the issue that the collaborative is working on shows promise to move beyond programmatic solutions and is committed to true systems change. So those are sort of the guidelines that I've heard them emphasize. But again, I would just underline that's not my forte and expertise, and I'd really encourage them to get in touch with their program manager and or the relevant strategy lead to really help sort of tease that out. They're there to help you, right? And certainly open to having those exploratory dialogues. And we'll direct you whichever way makes most sense.